welcome to Lowell Remembers. I'm Brian Dorrington, Director of Municipal Programming at LTC, and I'm here with local historian, TV personality, and radio personality, Jim Peters. He does it all, ladies and gentlemen. And today we're actually going to be talking about the Native American history of Lowell. It's vast, there's a lot of it, so we're going to barely scratch the surface today, but we will cover more in future episodes, for sure. So, Jim, why don't we start off with, when was the first contact between Native Americans and the European settlers?
Well, the first thing I want to say about the first contact is that the first contact was very detrimental to the Native Americans. They ended up being unable to handle the onslaught of new settlers coming from Europe. And they were in a disease-ridden state for 100 years. And they handled the disease as well as they could, but for instance, the Penacook.
Yes, so you mean the disease started when the settlers came? Yeah, okay, correct.
Right, and the primary disease that killed the Indians was smallpox.
Mm-hmm.
And the Americans, the Englishmen, were guilty of bacterial warfare.
Mm-hmm.
They padded blankets that they gave to the Indians with smallpox victims in England,
mm-hmm.
and then sent them over to the ship over to what was now the United States, the Merrimack River area, and they passed them out and killed something like 90% of the Indians in the area. So it wasn't a good first contact.
Yeah,
it became very difficult. The first contact was in about 1537, 1538.
Okay, so we're talking a long time ago.
Right, long before the Pilgrims. So
yeah, and now how many tribes were there in this area?
Well, the two that we're going to concentrate on today are the Wammasit and the Pataki.
In the Pataki, okay.
Okay.
And they were actually, from what I understand, part of a larger tribe, which is the Penacook. Penacook, okay.
Okay, now the Penacook was a confederacy that included Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a pretty good-sized confederacy.
Mm-hmm.
And it fought, it had a war going on for centuries with the Abenaki Indians in Maine. But the Pawtucket Indians were a part of the Confederacy,
mm-hmm.
and they were led by an Indian chief named Passaconaway.
Passaconaway, yeah. We're going to get into him a little later because there's a lot to say about Passaconaway, excuse me. But just to get some general background, how long were the Native Americans here before contact?
We have them dating back to the cavemen. It's estimated historically that the First Asians came across the Aleutian Islands when it was either iced over or somehow in place. They came across the Aleutian Islands and came to Alaska 20,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So the person that I read, who wrote The Bend in the River, stated that the Indians came even earlier than that. They were cavemen, and they certainly were carnivores,
mm-hmm.
because that was their primary source of protein.
Well, yeah, I mean, you pretty much had to be. There wasn't farming back then.
There was an attempt to farm. He found some stones that would indicate hoes and plows and that type of usage for the earth,
mm-hmm.
so that berries and fruit, vegetables and fruit could be tilled in an area like a garden.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't call it a garden. Obviously, they didn't know they had a garden, but
Right.
they had something like a garden. So it dates back to the
Paleolithic?
Paleolithic.
Paleolithic ages. Yeah,
Right,
yeah, I
right,
think that's
right.
the term. Wow. Okay, so they were been here. They were here a long time.
Yeah.
And now, in terms of Lowell,
Mm-hmm.
what areas of Lowell were these tribes occupying?
Okay, the Pawtucket occupied what's now Pawtucketville and Vesper Island,
Mm-hmm.
and they were nomads, and they shared. In the winter, they went to Winnipesaukee because the food was more available in that area, and in the summer they came to Vesper, and they primarily existed off of fish. Okay, this happened at a time when the Merrimack was full of fish.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and the Indians actually built structures to enslave the fish, to capture the fish, and they built a large dock made out of stone that's still there in the Merrimack River. If you go to Tingsboro and you look out, or could be Chelmsford, but I think it's Tingsboro, and you look out at the Merrimack River, you'll see a bunch of stones jetting above the river level.
Mm-hmm.
And that was because that was the dock at one point to catch fish. Now, they didn't have fishing lines, they didn't have hooks, they didn't have all that stuff. They had to use their hands.
Wow.
So the boys were taught to fish early, and there was an L-shaped dock that was built specifically to allow the salmon that ran on that side of the river up the river and right literally into the hands of the boys who were swimming in the river catching fish. And so it was expected of the boys who were catching fish that every night they would catch a canoe full and feed all of the Indians in the village.
Wow.
So they caught
That's
a canoe.
tough task.
They caught it, but they did it. They caught a canoe full of fish every day, and it was a tough task.
Yeah. Now the rivers in general were very important to the natives, right? They sort of honored the rivers and
Rivers were boundaries. They were spiritual.
Mhm.
The Passaconaway could, according to the legend, could turn himself into a tongue of fire, which is awfully close to the Catholic or Christian idea of the Holy Spirit turning into tongues of fire.
Yeah.
And he could turn himself into a tongue of fire, supposedly in the privacy of his own wigwam. He didn't have a tent; he had a wigwam. And in the privacy of his own wigwam, he supposedly could turn himself into a tongue of fire and then turn himself back into himself. And there's a very interesting story about all of that.
Yeah. And now we can get into Passaconaway, because you could do a whole episode on him. And I actually looked up what Passaconaway meant, child of the bear, which was kind of a suiting name, because even according to the Europeans, he was a huge man. I remember I was doing some research, and they said they could actually see him, perched off the coast, and he looked like bigger than any human they had ever seen. So he was a large figure, but he was also a larger than life figure.
Right.
So, why don't you tell us a little bit about Passaconaway in his role in the Native Americans in the Merrimack?
Well, as a boy, he was a fisherman. Okay. As a chief, he was in charge of all of the Pawtucket villages between Winnipesaukee and the Ting Island, which we call Vesper now. And he was in charge of all of those Native Americans who lived north of the Merrimack River, or to the east of the Merrimack River, depending on where you're looking at it from. He had his own council of elders that he had to keep happy. So there was a government thing to it. He had his own sort of government. He is the person who supposedly was made into a Christian by John Eliot, but there is some question as to whether or not he was made into a Christian for political or religious reasons, because he went back to being a chief and a god in the Pataki tribe later on in his life.
Yeah. So I had a question about that, because I was kind of unclear in some of the research. So he was a Penacook, but was he also in charge of the larger Penacook tribes as well? Did he lead that?
No, he led the Pataki tribes.
Okay, so he led the Pataki tribes.
The Penacook tribes are split into many different tribes.
Okay, but so he was a part of that.
Yeah, even the Massachusetts tribe was part of the Penacook Confederacy. Okay. We named Massachusetts after the tribe that we found, and I think that's kind of nice.
Sure.
That we named the state after the Indians. He then went to meet the English, and the English told him, took his son, daughter-in-law, and their child, and moved them by ropes. They put ropes around their necks and moved them to Boston to be enslaved.
And now, was his son a chief at this time too? Because I know his son.
One of his sons was a chief. Yeah.
Yeah, and is that the one that they took?
No, they took another son.
Okay.
And Passaconaway was asked when he would meet with the English, and he looked at them and said, "I will meet with the English when they return my son, his squaw, and his child." And they returned his son, his squaw, and his child. So he met with the English. He was very kind to the English. He was not a warrior type of Native American, and he was very kind to the English and helped them out a great deal. He even gave them all of his guns at one point, because the colonial legislature asked for his guns, and so he gave them all of his guns. I think he looked at the guns as things that probably didn't work very well, but at the time people didn't understand that 20 Indians with arrows could fire 5 times faster than they could load a musket and shoot at one Indian.
Wow.
So the Indians had the upper hand for quite a while. The thing that destroyed the Indians was the bacterial warfare. They went from 25,000 Pawtucket Indians in Massachusetts to 3,000 or less in one fell swoop.
Yeah. And now, was this done because that they were fighting the natives? Because it sounds like Passaconaway was peaceful. Was he warring at all with them?
No.
So was he accepting of the European settlers?
Yes.
He was.
Yes, and he was not warring with the European settlers, and he couldn't understand why the European settlers were warring with him, why they took his son, why they took his son into Boston and paraded him around like a parade animal, and that type of thing. So he couldn't determine why the whites were doing what the Europeans were doing what they were doing. So he lived long enough to meet John Smith, and John Eliot.
John Eliot, yeah, we got a lot to say about him too.
Yeah, well, there's quite a bit to say about him. But he met John Eliot, and they were sitting on a stone. Now you got to remember there was no falls at the time, so the river was a lot thinner than it is now. So they were sitting on a stone by the river, which now would be underwater, and John Eliot asked asked Passaconaway, "What is the name of this place?" And Passaconaway said, "The Merrimack." And he said it gutturally. It came out a little bit differently, but he said the Merrimack. And John Eliot said, "What does that mean?" And he said, "It's the strong place." So Merrimack means the strong place in Pataki. And so they kept the name of the river the Merrimack. It's a strong place. And the opposite side of the river was occupied by mostly the Wamasett tribe, although there were different tribes that occupied the other side of the river. And they traded back and forth. So there really wasn't a lot of enmity between Passaconaway and the English. He actually gave them almost everything they wanted, and they still wanted more. And so at one point the king appointed all the land that was the Indians, that was the Native Americans, from Ting Island up to Winnipesaukee to Colonel Ting in the Ting Mansion in Tingsboro. And they gave Colonel Ting all of the land between those two spots, Vesper and Winnipesaukee, and turned it into a
And there was absolutely no resistance from this? Was this land
he didn't
purchased?
He didn't go to war
just...
with them, and he wasn't part of King Philip's war.
Wow. Was this land purchased, or did the king just declare it?
He just declared it.
Wow.
So it would be like you and I going down to New York City with a flag with your last name on it, and pushing this bike into Central Park and saying this land belongs to Brian Dorrington.
Yeah.
It was much the same thought process went into it as that, and the king thought he was omnipotent, so it made for a very difficult time for the Native Americans. So Passaconaway was baptized. Again, we weren't sure if it was a political or a religious baptism, because he did end up going back to his original faith.
After. Yeah, so let's get into that. Let's get into John Eliot, and then the term praying Indians. Can you tell us what the term means or is supposed to mean?
Praying Indians was praying Indians. The John Eliot connection was that Eliot really tried to convert the Pawtucket and other tribes, and he thought they thought he was so successful because he converted Passaconaway, and he didn't realize he wasn't successful. He put out all of his own news stories on the conversion. He wrote them all himself, and he quoted Passaconaway as saying a few things that English literature specialists have difficulty with, because there was such precise English literature that they thought that was made up. So there is a possibility that Eliot made up some of the stuff that he did. I think he did baptize Passaconaway. I don't think Passaconaway had the slightest idea of what it meant.
Right.
Beyond the stories that he had been told about Jesus Christ and stuff.
Right. But the term praying Indian was actually a term used for Native Americans that were transformed or whatever to Christianity, adopted Christianity. Right. And from what I read, that there were actually a good amount of them in this region.
There was a large amount of Catholic ones.
Catholic.
Okay, and that's because there was a French Catholic priest who worked the Penacook Indians closer to the border, closer to the ocean, who worked over that group of Indians, and he he converted a couple thousand of them to Catholicism. So if you go up to Maine, people who are still Catholics date back to the Indians, and a lot of them have Indian heritage. So, but they're Catholic.
And were these like forced conversions, or was
no,
this
not
more
this one wasn't.
Really?
Pasconoways was apparently, but this one was. I don't know what appealed to the Indians about the Catholic Church, but all I know is that I read that there was a great deal of conversion to the Catholic faith by, can't remember the name of the man, and I don't have it on my computer, but by the Europeans.
Yeah. No. Yeah, I read that there were quite a few as well.
Right.
So we're
praying Indians would be those Indians that converted probably to Catholicism. Could be Episcopalianism, which is what John Eliot was selling.
Yeah.
And we're not sure. In the English, to be honest with you, puzzled Passaconaway quite a bit, because the English were so determined to be the holders of the land. Now, the Indians didn't believe you could hold land. They didn't think holding land made any more sense than saying that the Merrimack River belongs to me, or the sky is mine. They thought land was just something that you used and while you were alive, and you were buried in it. And they found, when they were digging up the VFW highway, they were digging up grave sites of Native Americans all up and down the VFW highway, and that wasn't at a time when they did archaeological digs. So they didn't do archaeological digs. They just dug up the highway, and the bones scattered. And but they found a number of cemeteries.
Wow. And there's actually a very large population of Native Americans in the Lowell Cemetery, right?
Right. Jack Kerouac was comparing. He didn't name it Lowell. He named it Galloway. And he was comparing Galloway to Lowell, and he said, quote, "Something in the invisible brooding landscape surrounding the town, somewhere in the bright stars nodding close to a hillside where the old cemetery sleeps, something in the soft swishing tree leaves over the fields and the stone walls tells people a different story." And that's from the Town and the City in 1950. And it seemed to me to be very appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Indians put most of their people in what's now the Lowell Cemetery, and we dug them up.
Yeah, and that brings us to, we're getting close to the end here. Why don't we just talk a little bit about the demise and when I know you know the date where the last Native American actually left.
Well, the last Native American actually left in 1826, the year the Lowell was incorporated.
Wow.
And he left Lowell. Now, Lowell at the time was much smaller than it is now. So I don't know where he lived in Lowell specifically or anything, but the English version of the history is that the last American Indian, not the last Native American, left in 1826. And the interesting part is that in 1653 they think Passaconaway died, and they killed an amazing amount of meat for his funeral, like thousands of animals.
Wow.
And he supposedly was met with a flaming chariot that picked up his sled that his body was on and carried it into a cloud.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
And he was at least 100. He died at least 108, I believe, according to some records. Some people say he lived actually till 120.
Possibly.
Yeah, according to the records, he lived a very long time. We're almost done here. We barely scratched the surface. We're going to have to do it again.
We haven't scratched the surface.
So, but why don't you tell people about what you would envision?
What I'd like to see is Jay Gaffney is an expert on the Wamesett tribe.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to see Jay Gaffney and either Peter's Principles or on this show talk about the Native Americans, especially the Wamesett tribe, because Wamesett had Trail of Tears,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not sure what that meant. And I'd like to see people tell us stories that they've heard about the Native Americans so that we can corroborate them and use them on the show. Because we're going to be doing a few Native American pieces, I would think.
Yeah. And you also believe there should be some sort of plaque or something at the least in Lowell.
There was a tribe in Belvedere on the east side of the Concord River, so they couldn't get on this side really, because there are no bridges. So the Concord River was a big impediment. But there was on the east side of the Concord River, there was a village of what was estimated to be 13,000 Native Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And that village was eventually farmed under. And I think that we owe the Native Americans who were there, and I can next time we meet, I can give you the Native American Indian chief's name.
Okay.
But he was Passaconaway's son, so he was a Pawtucket, and so we estimate that the Native Americans, the 13,000 Native Americans on that side, were at Pawtucket.
So you'd like to see some sort of memorial there?
I would love to see a memorial to the Native Americans. They had a beautiful memorial to the Native Americans in Pawtucketville, and they took it down. And somewhere in the city is a really nice statue of Passaconaway.
That's great. Well, we'd like to keep continuing this conversation, but we're up against a hard break. I think we're actually a little over time. It goes up fast. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks again to Jim for all the enlightening information. And we'll see you next time on Lowell Remembers. Thanks for watching.